woman in blood-stained silk collapsed in the desert dust, gasping for breath as vultures circled overhead. Behind her, smoke still rose from the burning wagon where her family had died screaming. The bandits would return, they always did, to silence the only witness. Miles away, a man who'd sworn never to care about another soul rode the boundary of his cursed ranch, unaware that in minutes he would make the choice that would either kill him or save him. One act of mercy, one desperate lie, and the frontier would run red with blood before it was over. If you're ready for a story of survival, forbidden partnership, and the brutal cost of protection on the lawless frontier, stay with me until the very end. And comment below with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The sun that afternoon didn't just shine, it punished. It hammered down on the Colorado frontier like the fist of something angry and eternal, turning the air thick and shimmering, baking the red earth until it cracked open in desperate, jagged lines. Heat rose in visible waves across the barren expanse, distorting the horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Nothing moved except the wind, which came in hot gusts that carried dust and the smell of sage, and something else. Something darker, like burnt wood and copper. Darren Holt rode his black gelding along the western fence line of his ranch, his eyes scanning the distance with the practiced wariness of a man who'd learned that survival depended on seeing trouble before trouble saw you. His hat was pulled low against the brutal glare, casting his face in shadow. A hard face, all sharp angles and weathered skin, with pale blue eyes that held no warmth. At 34, he looked older. The frontier did that to people. It carved years into their faces, wrote stories in the lines around their eyes and mouths. Darren's story was one of betrayal and violence, of trust broken so completely that he'd rebuilt his life around a single principle: solitude. The ranch spread out behind him, 200 acres of unforgiving land that nobody else had wanted. A modest cabin sat at the center, its timber walls dark with age, its single window facing east toward the rising sun. A barn, a corral, a well. Nothing else. No neighbors within 10 miles. No visitors, ever. That's how Darren wanted it. That's how it had been for 3 years, since the day he'd ridden away from everything he'd once called home, with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a heart that had turned to stone. He was checking the integrity of the fence posts. Some had begun to lean after the last windstorm, when he saw it, a dark shape in the distance, small and irregular against the pale expanse of desert. At first he thought it was a coyote, maybe injured, crawling across the open ground. But as he urged his horse forward, squinting against the glare, the shape resolved into something that made his stomach tighten with a familiar dread. A person, collapsed in the dirt, not moving. Darren's jaw clenched. He sat perfectly still for a long moment, his hand resting on the rifle secured to his saddle. Every instinct he'd honed over years of hard survival screamed at him to turn around, to ride back to his cabin, close the door, and forget what he'd seen. The frontier was littered with tragedy. People died out here all the time, from thirst, from heat, from snakebite, from 100 different kinds of bad luck and poor judgment. It wasn't his problem. It wasn't his responsibility. He started to turn the horse. Then the figure moved, just barely. A hand lifted a few inches from the ground, trembling, before falling back into the dust. "Damn it," Darren muttered. He kicked his horse forward. As he approached, details emerged that made the scene stranger with each passing second. The person was small, slender, a woman, he realized, but her clothing was unlike anything he'd ever seen on the frontier. Instead of the practical calico dresses or worn traveling clothes typical of women in this territory, she wore what appeared to be some kind of flowing silk robe in a deep, faded red. The fabric was torn and filthy, covered in dust and dark stains that might have been blood. Her black hair had come loose from whatever style it had been arranged in, spilling across her shoulders and the ground around her. One of her hands clutched something, a small, embroidered bag. Darren dismounted 10 feet away, his hand never leaving his rifle. "Ma'am?" No response. He moved closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. When he was close enough to see her face, he stopped, caught off guard by what he saw. She was young, maybe 22, 23, and despite the dirt and exhaustion etched into her features, she was striking. Her skin was pale beneath the dust and sunburn, her features delicate but strong. Chinese, he realized. He'd seen Chinese workers in Denver years ago, laboring on the railroads, but never out here. Never alone in the middle of nowhere wearing traditional silk clothing that belonged in a painting, not a desert. "Ma'am," he said again, louder this time, "can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark eyes, disoriented and glazed with pain and dehydration. They focused on him slowly, struggling to make sense of his face hovering above her. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he didn't understand. Chinese, he assumed. The sounds were soft, desperate. "I don't understand," Darren said. He knelt beside her, still wary, still ready to pull back if this turned out to be some kind of trap. He'd heard stories of bandits using injured women as bait. "Do you speak English?" Her hand lifted again, reaching toward him, and he saw that her palm was torn and bleeding, embedded with small stones from where she'd crawled. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible but unmistakably English. "Please, help." Darren's eyes swept the surrounding desert. No wagon, no horse, no sign of how she'd gotten here or where she'd come from. Just endless red earth and scattered sage stretching in every direction. He looked back down at her, saw the way her whole body trembled despite the suffocating heat, saw the tears that had cut clean tracks through the dust on her face. He knew what helping her would mean. Questions, complications, possible danger, everything he'd spent 3 years avoiding. "Where did you come from?" he asked. She tried to sit up and failed, falling back with a soft cry of pain. Her hand pressed against her side, and when she pulled it away, Darren saw fresh blood on her fingers. Not a lot, but enough to indicate she was injured beyond simple exhaustion and exposure. "Bandits," she managed, forcing the English words out with obvious effort. Her accent was thick, musical despite her distress. "They killed everyone. My family, the wagon. They took everything. I ran so far." Darren's stomach went cold. Bandits meant trouble of the worst kind. If they'd attacked a traveling party, they'd be looking for survivors, looking for witnesses, looking to tie up loose ends. And if he brought this woman to his ranch, if anyone saw her there. "How long ago?" he demanded. "This morning, early, before sun." That meant they'd been searching for her all day. They might still be searching. They might be close. Darren stood abruptly, taking 3 steps back, putting distance between himself and the choice that lay bleeding in the dirt before him. Leave her, and she'd die before nightfall. Bring her with him, and he might die alongside her when the bandits came looking. He'd survived 3 years by making smart choices, by staying out of other people's problems, by keeping his ranch isolated and his own counsel. This was not a smart choice. The woman's eyes had closed again. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. Her hand still clutched that embroidered bag like it was the only thing tethering her to life. "Damn it," Darren said again, but this time there was resignation in his voice. He walked back to his horse, pulled his canteen free, and returned to kneel beside her. Sliding one arm beneath her shoulders, he lifted her just enough to bring the canteen to her lips. "Drink." Slowly. She did, gulping desperately until he pulled it away. "Slow," I said. "You'll make yourself sick." Her eyes opened again, meeting his with an intensity that surprised him. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." He studied her for another moment, calculating. She was small, couldn't weigh much more than 100 pounds, even in those elaborate silk layers. The wound in her side didn't look deep, probably caught a piece of flying debris or grazed by a bullet during her escape. Dehydration and exhaustion were the immediate dangers. "Can you stand?" She tried. Got 1 foot under her, then collapsed back with a gasp of pain and frustration. "All right," Darren muttered. He made his decision, committed to it fully in the way he did everything. No hesitation, no looking back. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she actually was despite the yards of silk wrapped around her. She made a small sound of protest, her pride clearly objecting even as her body went limp against his chest. He carried her to his horse, and this presented a new problem. The gelding was well trained but not used to carrying 2 riders, especially when one was unconscious and dressed in blood-stained foreign silk. Darren managed to hoist himself into the saddle while holding her, settling her across his lap in a way that wouldn't jar her injured side. The horse shifted nervously beneath the unfamiliar weight distribution. "Easy," Darren murmured, steadying the animal with his knees while keeping one arm locked around the woman to prevent her from sliding. She'd lost consciousness again, her head falling against his shoulder, her black hair spilling across his arm. He turned the horse toward home, acutely aware of how exposed they were out here, how easy it would be for anyone watching from higher ground to see them. The ride back to the ranch took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Darren's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the ridges, the scattered rock formations, anywhere that men with rifles might hide and watch. Nothing moved except the heat shimmer and the occasional tumbling sage. When his cabin finally came into view, he allowed himself one small breath of relief. They'd made it this far. Now came the harder part, figuring out what to do with her. He dismounted carefully, managing to keep her cradled in his arms without dropping her or aggravating her injury. The cabin door stood open. He'd left in a hurry that morning, checking the fence line before the heat became unbearable. He carried her inside, blinking against the relative dimness after the brutal sunlight. The cabin's interior was sparse, functional. A wood stove in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and ammunition, his bedroll in the far corner. No decoration, no softness, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here rather than simply existed. Darren laid her on his bedroll, the only remotely comfortable surface available. Her silk robe, he didn't know what else to call it, fanned out around her, the red fabric so out of place against the rough wool blanket that it looked like something from a fever dream. He stepped back, hands on his hips, and tried to think practically. First, water and treatment for that wound. He retrieved his medical kit, basic supplies he'd learned to use out of necessity after one too many accidents with no doctor within 50 miles. He also filled a basin with water from his supply barrel and grabbed a clean cloth. Kneeling beside her, he hesitated before carefully pulling aside the torn silk to expose her side. The wound was as he'd suspected, a deep gash rather than a bullet hole, probably from debris or maybe a knife. It had bled considerably but wasn't currently gushing, which was good. He cleaned it as gently as possible, though she still gasped and twisted even in her unconscious state. The antiseptic he applied made her cry out, her eyes flying open in confusion and pain. "I know," he said quietly, pressing the cloth against the wound. "I know it hurts, but it needs to be done." She stared at him, her breath coming in sharp pants, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes. But she didn't pull away. She held still, her hands fisted in the blanket beneath her, and let him work. "What's your name, what?" Darren asked, trying to distract her as he wrapped clean bandaging around her torso. "Xiao Yue," she managed. "My name? Xiao Yue." "Xiao Yue," he repeated, probably mangling the pronunciation. "I'm Darren Holt. This is my ranch." You saved me." "Maybe. Or maybe I just delayed the inevitable. We'll see." He finished with the bandage and sat back. "You need rest. Water. Food when you can keep it down. But first, I need you to tell me everything. Who attacked you? How many? What direction did you run?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she'd passed out again. But then she spoke, her voice steady despite her obvious pain and exhaustion. "We were traveling, my family, from California, going to Denver. There were 5 wagons, merchants. We carried silk, tea, jade, valuable things." Her accent made some words difficult, but her English was better than he'd initially thought. "This morning, before light, men came. Many men. With guns. They killed the drivers first, then they—" Her voice broke. "My father tried to fight. They shot him. My mother, You don't have to—" "They killed everyone," she said flatly, opening her eyes to stare at the rough timber ceiling. "Men, women, children. They took the goods, burned what they didn't want. I was hiding under bags of rice in our wagon. When they set fire to it, I had to run. I just ran. I didn't know where. Just away." Darren's jaw tightened. It was a familiar story on the frontier. Traveling merchants were easy targets, especially if they carried valuable cargo. The fact that she'd escaped at all was remarkable. "How many men?" "I don't know. Many. 10, 12. "Did you see their leader? Anything distinct about him?" She closed her eyes again, remembering. "Yes, the leader. Tall. Very tall. Beard like fire. Red and gold. He wore a coat. Black coat. Expensive. He laughed when my father fell." A cold weight settled in Darren's chest. He knew exactly who she was describing. Garrett Lynch. The name alone could empty a saloon or silence a room. Lynch ran the most ruthless bandit gang in the territory, a dozen hard men who preyed on travelers, small ranches, anyone they could rob without facing serious opposition. They were known for leaving no witnesses, no survivors. The fact that Xiao Yue had escaped would enrage Lynch. He'd send his men to find her, to eliminate the one person who could identify them, and when they didn't find her body in the desert, they'd expand their search to every ranch, every settlement within a day's ride of the attack. "You know him," Xiao Yue said, reading Darren's expression. "The man I described. You know him." "Garrett Lynch," Darren confirmed grimly. "And if he knows you survived, he'll hunt you until he finds you, no matter how long it takes." She pushed herself up on one elbow, despite his gesture to stay down. "Then I will leave. Tonight. I won't bring this danger to you. You've done enough. You won't make it a mile," Darren interrupted. "You're injured, exhausted, dehydrated, and you don't know this land. You'd be dead by dawn." He stood pacing to the window, looking out at the empty expanse of his ranch. "Besides, if they're already searching, leaving now would just get you caught faster. At least here you've got walls, and someone who knows how to use a rifle." "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. My problems are not yours." It was a good question. One Darren had asked himself from the moment he'd turned his horse toward her collapsed form instead of away. "I don't know," he admitted. That night, as darkness finally brought relief from the suffocating heat, Darren sat at his table cleaning his rifle while Xiao Yue slept fitfully on his bedroll. He'd given her water, some dried beef that she'd managed to keep down, and one of his shirts to replace the torn silk, though she'd insisted on keeping the robe nearby, folded carefully despite its ruined state. Every few minutes his eyes would drift to her, taking in details he'd been too focused to notice earlier. The graceful line of her neck, the way her hair, even tangled and dirty, caught the lamplight like black silk. The strength in her features despite their delicacy. She wasn't helpless, he realized. Fragile, yes, in this moment. Injured and displaced. But there was steel underneath. She'd survived a massacre, escaped armed bandits, crawled miles through desert heat. That took more than luck. It took will. A sound outside brought him to his feet instantly, rifle raised. He moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Probably just an animal. A coyote, maybe, or... There. Movement near the barn. His heart rate accelerated. He checked his rifle, made sure the spare ammunition was within reach, and moved to the door. Behind him, he heard Xiao Yue stir. "Stay down," he ordered quietly. "Don't make a sound." He slipped outside into the cool night air, every sense heightened. The moon was only a sliver, providing almost no light. He relied on sound, on instinct, on the intimate knowledge of every inch of his property. Another sound, definitely something large, near the corral. Darren circled wide, approaching from an angle that would give him the advantage if it came to shooting. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing slow and controlled. Then he saw it. His own horse, the black gelding, standing at the corral fence and snorting nervously at something. Not a person. An animal of some kind had probably spooked it. Darren lowered the rifle slightly, letting out a breath. False alarm. His nerves were strung too tight, seeing threats in every shadow. He was about to turn back when instinct made him freeze. There, on the ridge to the east, barely visible against the star-scattered sky, the silhouette of a man on horseback, watching. Darren's blood turned to ice. He didn't move, didn't raise the rifle, didn't give any indication he'd seen the watcher. Instead, he continued his casual circle back toward the cabin, forcing his steps to remain unhurried, unconcerned, just a rancher checking his property after a noise. But inside, his mind raced. They knew. Somehow, Lynch's men knew she was here, or at least suspected. That watcher would report back, and then... He slipped back inside the cabin, barred the door, and returned to the window. The silhouette remained on the ridge for another minute, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. "What is it?" Xiao Yue had sat up, her eyes wide and alert despite her exhaustion. "What did you see?" Darren set his rifle against the wall but kept it close. "We've got bigger problems than I thought. They're already watching the ranch." Her face went pale. They found me. I'll go right now before. You'll stay exactly where you are, Darren said firmly. He pulled out the other chair and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Running now would be suicide. They're watching. If you left, they'd follow, catch you before you made it half a mile. At least here we've got defensible ground. But you'll die because of me, because you helped me. Maybe. He met her eyes across the dim room. Or maybe we'll figure something out. Either way, the decision's made. You're staying. She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her wrestling with it, her obvious gratitude conflicting with her equally obvious guilt at the danger she'd brought to his door. Finally, she nodded. Then I will not be a burden, she said quietly. Whatever I can do to help, I will do. I am stronger than I look. I don't doubt it. Anyone who survived what you did has strength enough. Silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove's dying embers. Outside, the night remained still, but Darren knew it was the stillness before violence. Lynch's men would come. The only questions were when and how many. Tell me about him, Xiao Yue said suddenly. This Lynch, what kind of man is he? Darren considered how to answer. The worst kind. Smart enough to avoid direct confrontation with law enforcement, ruthless enough to kill without hesitation, and experienced enough to know how to get away with it. He's been operating in this territory for 5 years, and every attempt to bring him in has failed. He's got contacts, informants, people too scared to testify against him. And you? You're not afraid of him? I didn't say that. I said I know how to use a rifle. There's a difference between not being afraid and being prepared to do what's necessary. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, though the night wasn't particularly cold. In my country, there is a saying, a single tree cannot make a forest. It means we need each other. We are stronger together than alone. In my experience, Darren said quietly, trusting other people is the fastest way to get yourself killed. And yet you trusted me, a stranger, someone who brought danger to your home. I didn't trust you, I just couldn't leave you to die. There is trust in that choice, whether you admit it or not. Darren had no response to that. He stood, checked the rifle again, though he'd just cleaned it, and moved back to the window. The ridge remained empty. The night remained still, but he could feel it building, the storm that was coming. It pressed against his awareness like a physical weight. You should sleep, he told Xiao Yue. Tomorrow we'll need to make plans, figure out how to handle this. What about you? I'll keep watch. You need sleep too. I'll manage. She studied him for a moment, then lay back down, though he could tell she wasn't actually sleeping. Just resting, conserving strength, while her mind undoubtedly raced with the same fears and calculations that occupied his own thoughts. Darren settled into the chair by the window, rifle across his lap, and prepared for a long night. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Every sound made his hand tighten on the rifle, the wind rattling the shutters, a distant coyote's howl, the settling of the cabin's old timbers. But no riders approached. No attack came. As dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Darren finally allowed himself to relax slightly. They'd made it through one night. That was something. Behind him, Xiao Yue stirred, sitting up slowly and pressing one hand to her bandaged side. Morning, she said softly. Morning. They didn't come. No, but they will. Darren stood, stretching muscles that had cramped from hours of motionless vigilance. Lynch is patient when he needs to be. He'll watch, plan, wait for the right moment. Could be today. Could be a week from now. Xiao Yue stood as well, moving carefully but with more strength than the previous night. She'd recovered remarkably well, he noted. The water and rest had already made a visible difference. She walked to the stove, examined it with obvious unfamiliarity, then looked at him questioningly. You know how to cook? On this? No, but I can learn. There was that steel again, that quiet determination. Darren found himself almost smiling, something he hadn't done in years. I'll show you, he said. We've got to eat anyway. He built up the fire while she watched intently, memorizing each step. Then he showed her how to prepare coffee in the battered pot, how to fry salt pork in the iron skillet, how to work with the limited supplies and primitive tools. She learned quickly, her hands moving with a natural grace even while performing unfamiliar tasks. Within an hour, she'd managed to produce a passable breakfast, and they sat across from each other at the small table, eating in companionable silence. "This place?" Xiao Yue said eventually, looking around the sparse cabin. "You live here alone? Always?" "For 3 years." "No wife? No family?" His face hardened. "No." She heard the warning in that single word and didn't press. Instead, she asked, "What will you do when they come?" "Fight. What else is there?" "Run, hide, negotiate." "I don't run. This is my land. And Lynch doesn't negotiate. He eliminates threats. The only language he understands is violence." Xiao Yue set down her fork, her dark eyes serious. "Then we must be ready for violence. Show me how to shoot." Darren started to refuse automatically, then stopped. She was right. If it came to a fight, when it came to a fight, having another person who could handle a weapon might make the difference between survival and death. "You ever held a gun before?" "No, but I learned fast. You said so yourself." That afternoon, Darren set up targets near the barn, empty bottles lined up on fence posts. He showed Xiao Yue how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to control her breathing and squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. Her first shot went wide, the recoil nearly knocking her off her feet, but her second shot clipped the edge of a bottle. By the 10th shot, she'd shattered 3 bottles cleanly. "Natural talent," Darren observed. "Desperation," she corrected. "I will not die helpless." She boshke. As the sun climbed toward noon, they worked together, him teaching, her learning with fierce concentration. And slowly, without quite noticing when it happened, they began to function as a unit. He would call corrections, she would adjust. She would ask questions. He would answer. The silence between them shifted from awkward to comfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between people who've begun to trust each other. That evening, as Xiao Yue prepared dinner with increasing confidence, Darren checked the perimeter one more time. No watchers on the ridge, no sign of riders. But his instinct screamed that the calm wouldn't last. He was right. The next morning, 3 riders appeared on the eastern horizon. They didn't approach directly. Instead, they circled slowly, deliberately, making sure Darren saw them, making sure he knew he was being watched. Xiao Yu stood beside him at the cabin door, her hand tight on the rifle he'd given her. "Is it them?" "Lynch's men, scouting, seeing what kind of resistance they'll face." "What do we do?" Darren's mind raced through options. The ranch was defensible. The cabin had thick walls, limited entry points, good sight lines. But 3 men today might mean 10 tomorrow, or 20. Lynch could bring overwhelming force if he decided it was necessary. Unless an idea formed, dangerous, risky, but possibly their only chance. "How good are you at pretending?" Darren asked. Xiao Yue looked at him in confusion. "Pretending what?" "We're married. That you're my wife, not some refugee who wandered onto my property. Lynch's men won't attack a legitimate household as readily as they would a lone man harboring a fugitive. It might buy us time. It might even make them think twice." She understood immediately. "And if they don't believe us?" "Then we were dead anyway. At least this gives us a chance." Xiao Yue stared out at the distant riders, then back at Darren. "All right," she said finally. "I'll be your wife. And pretend. It has to be convincing. They'll be looking for any sign of deception. Then we make it convincing." She was braver than she had any right to be. This small woman in her torn silk robe who'd lost everything and still stood straight and spoke with quiet confidence. Darren felt something shift in his chest, something he'd thought dead for years. "There's one more thing," he said. "We'll need to make some changes. To you, to how you present yourself. Those silk clothes, they mark you as foreign, as other, as exactly the kind of person Lynch's men would be hunting." Pain flickered across her face. "This robe belonged to my grandmother. It's all I have left of my family." "I know, and I'm sorry. But if you want to survive, you need to look like you belong here. Like you've been here for months, not days." Xiao Yue closed her eyes briefly, struggling with the choice. Then she nodded. "Show me what I need to do." They spent the rest of that day transforming her appearance. Darren had an extra shirt and pair of trousers that they modified to fit her smaller frame. She tied her hair back in a simple style common to frontier women. The silk robe was carefully folded and hidden away, a piece of her past that had no place in the fiction they were creating. When she emerged from changing behind the privacy screen Darren had hastily erected, she looked completely different. Still beautiful, but in a way that would blend into the frontier landscape rather than stand out against it. She moved differently, too, as if shedding the formal grace of her traditional clothing had freed her to be something new. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like a rancher's wife," Darren said. Then, surprising himself, he added, "A brave one." That night they sat together planning their strategy, their story, how they'd met. She'd been traveling with a merchant caravan that had stopped at his ranch for water 3 months ago. They'd married quickly, informally, in the way frontier people often did without benefit of official ceremony. She'd stayed while the caravan moved on, choosing this life with him over continued travel. It was simple enough to be believable, detailed enough to withstand casual questioning. "Tomorrow," Darren said, "when they come closer, and they will come closer, we present a united front. You stand beside me. You show no fear. You act like this ranch is your home because you chose it, not because you're hiding." "I understand." "And Xiao Yue? If it goes wrong, if shooting starts, you run. You take my spare horse and you ride north toward the settlement. Don't look back." She met his eyes steadily. "I won't leave you to die alone." "That's not your choice to make." "In this, it is." They stared at each other across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, a commitment, a bond forged in shared danger and desperate necessity. The morning dawned clear and hot, the sun once again punishing the red earth. Darren and Xiao Yue stood together outside the cabin as 3 riders approached openly this time, no longer bothering with stealth or distance. They stopped 30 yards out, close enough to talk, close enough to shoot. The lead rider was a heavy man with a thick beard and small, cruel eyes. He looked Darren up and down, then let his gaze linger on Xiao Yue in a way that made Darren's trigger finger itch. "Morning," the man called out. "Name's Cooper. We're looking for someone. Chinese woman traveling alone. You seen anyone like that around here?" Darren kept his rifle pointed casually downward, non-threatening but ready. "This is private property, and no, can't say I have." Cooper's eyes narrowed. "That's so, because we got word a woman matching that description was spotted heading this direction a couple days back. Like I said, haven't seen anyone." Darren paused deliberately. "Except my wife, of course, but she's been here 3 months. Hardly counts as traveling alone." The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Cooper's eyes moved between Darren and Xiao Yue, calculating, suspicious. The 2 men flanking him shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Then Xiao Yue stepped forward, slipping her arm through Darren's with perfect naturalness, her body language radiating possession and confidence. "Is there something else we can help you with?" she asked, her English clear despite her accent. "We have work to do, and you're keeping us from it." It was a perfect performance, the slightly irritated wife, protective of her home and her time. Cooper's suspicion didn't disappear, but it wavered. Uncertainty crept into his cruel eyes. "Your wife, you say?" "That's right," Darren confirmed. "Married 3 months now. Been a good partnership." He let steel enter his voice. "And I don't take kindly to armed men questioning me about her on my own land." The standoff stretched out, tension vibrating in the air like heat shimmer. Darren could feel Xiao Yue trembling slightly against his arm, but her face remained calm, defiant even. She was magnificent in that moment, fragile and fierce all at once. Finally, Cooper spat into the dust. "Must have been mistaken then. Sorry to trouble you." But his tone said he wasn't sorry at all. His tone said this wasn't over. The 3 riders turned and began to move away, but slowly, reluctantly. Darren and Xiao Yue stood perfectly still, maintaining the fiction until the riders crested the distant ridge and disappeared. Only then did Xiao Yue's legs buckle. Darren caught her, lowering her to sit on the cabin steps. "I thought he would shoot," she whispered. "I thought—" "You did perfectly," Darren said. "You were perfect." She looked up at him, and there were tears on her cheeks now, all the fear she'd suppressed during the confrontation finally breaking free. "They'll come back." "You know they will. Cooper didn't believe us." I know, but we bought ourselves time. That's what matters. What neither of them said aloud was that the next visit wouldn't be a polite inquiry. The next visit would be violence unleashed. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, everything would change. The days that followed Cooper's visit passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, each morning arriving with the weight of waiting, each sunset bringing relief that violence had been postponed for another night. Darren found himself living in two simultaneous realities, the surface calm of ranch routine and the underlying current of constant vigilance that never let him fully relax his guard. Xiaoyue adapted to frontier life with a speed that both impressed and unsettled him. She was up before dawn each morning, building the fire before he'd even risen from his bedroll on the floor. He'd insisted she keep the bed despite her protests. She learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove with increasing confidence, transforming their limited supplies of salt pork, beans, and cornmeal into meals that, while simple, had a warmth to them his solitary cooking had never achieved. She mended his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, hauled water from the well without complaint despite the brutal midday heat, and worked alongside him repairing fence posts with a determination that seemed almost angry in its intensity. "You don't have to prove anything," Darren told her on the fourth morning as he watched her struggle with a particularly stubborn post that needed resetting. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her sun-darkened skin. "I proved to myself. Not to you. Your side is healing. I'm not fragile." He'd noticed that about her vocabulary. When she was tired or stressed, her English became more broken, words falling away until she spoke in short, fierce declarations. But in calm moments, her facility with the language was remarkable. She'd explained one evening that her father had insisted all his children learn English for business purposes. The memory had brought tears to her eyes that she'd quickly blinked away. Darren didn't push. He understood the need to keep moving, to stay busy, to avoid the quiet moments when grief could catch up. He'd lived that way for 3 years, but working alongside her created an intimacy that had nothing to do with the pretend marriage and everything to do with shared survival. Their hands would brush when passing tools. Their bodies would move in unconscious coordination, one anticipating the other's movements. When they spoke, conversations that began about practical matters, whether they had enough ammunition, where the water table was lowest, would sometimes drift into unexpected territory. "Why did you choose to live alone?" she asked one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of corral fence damaged by his horse's nervous pacing during a recent windstorm. Darren hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "Didn't choose it. Circumstances made the choice for me." "What circumstances?" He was silent for so long she probably thought he wouldn't answer. Then, surprising himself, he said, "I had a ranch once. Bigger than this. Good land, near a settlement. Had a partner, someone I trusted. We built it together from nothing." He paused, measuring his next words. "He sold me out, forged documents, convinced the bank I'd defaulted on loans I'd already paid, took ownership while I was away buying cattle. By the time I got back, it was done. Legal and final." Xiaoyue stopped working, giving him her full attention. "You couldn't fight it?" "With what? I'd put everything into that ranch, had nothing left for lawyers or bribes. And the law?" He drove another nail, the sound sharp in the still air. "The law favors whoever has the most money and the best story. He had both." "So you came here, bought this worthless piece of desert that nobody wanted with the last money I had. Figured if I was going to be alone, might as well be somewhere nobody could take from me again." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said softly, "My father had a saying, 'The bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists.' He meant that surviving requires flexibility, adaptation, but I think he was wrong." She met Darren's eyes. "Sometimes surviving requires becoming hard, like stone, so nothing can break you again." "Is that what you're doing? Becoming stone?" "I'm trying, but I don't think I'm very good at it yet." Darren saw the truth in that. She was strong, yes, but there was a softness in her still, a vulnerability she couldn't quite armor away. It showed in the way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task, staring at nothing, lost in memories, in how she'd kept that ruined silk robe hidden beneath his spare blanket, taking it out at night to hold like a talisman against all she'd lost. That evening, as purple twilight painted the desert in shades of shadow and dying light, they sat together on the cabin steps watching the horizon. It had become a ritual of sorts, this quiet vigil at day's end. Partly it was practical, scanning for riders, for threats, but it was also something else, something neither of them named. "Tell me about China," Darren said. "About your life before." Xiao Yue pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "My family lived in San Francisco. Not China itself. I was born in California, but we kept the old ways, traditional dress, traditional customs. My father said we must remember where we came from, even as we built new lives." "Big family." "5 brothers and sisters. I was the second youngest." Her voice went soft. "My oldest brother, Wei, he was learning the business. Going to take over for my father someday. My sister May was going to marry in the spring. We were traveling to Denver so her future husband's family could meet us. And little June..." She stopped, pressed her face against her knees. "He was only 6. He liked stories, always begging me to tell him stories about warriors and dragons." Darren sat very still, letting her find her own pace through the memories. "The night before the attack, June couldn't sleep. He came to my bedroll and asked me to tell him about the warrior who turned into a dragon to protect his village. I told him to go back to sleep, that I was tired." Her voice broke. "The last thing I said to him was, 'Leave me alone.' And in the morning, 'Don't,' Darren said quietly. 'Don't do that to yourself.' How can I not? If I had known, if I had just told him one more story, you'd still be running from the same bandits, still be fighting to survive. The only difference would be one more memory to torture yourself with." He turned to look at her profile in the fading light. "The dead don't need our guilt. They need us to keep living, to make their loss mean something by not wasting the life they don't get to have." She looked at him then, tears streaming silently down her face. "Is that what you do? Live hard enough for 2 people? You and whoever you lost?" The question hit like a physical blow. Darren stood abruptly. "I should check the perimeter before full dark." He walked away before she could respond, before she could see that her words had found the exact wound he'd spent 3 years trying to cauterize. He hadn't lost anyone to death. That would have been cleaner somehow. He'd lost them to betrayal. His partner. The woman he'd planned to marry who'd chosen the partner instead. The friends who'd looked the other way when everything was stolen from him. Somehow, that felt worse than grief. It felt like failure. When he returned 20 minutes later, Xiao Yue had gone inside. He found her standing at the stove, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. "I'm sorry," she said without turning around. "I asked too many questions. Pushed too hard. In my family, we talked about everything. But I understand you're different. I'll stop." "It's not that. It's just..." Darren struggled to find words for something he'd never tried to articulate. "I came here to forget. To leave the past dead and buried. Having you here, having conversations like this, it makes everything feel too close again." She turned then. "But the past isn't dead, Darren. Not for you. Not for me. We carry it with us whether we talk about it or not." She moved closer, her dark eyes serious. "Maybe that's why we found each other. Maybe we both needed someone who understands that weight. We didn't find each other. You collapsed in my desert, and I was too stupid to leave you there." A small smile touched her lips, despite the heaviness of the moment. "Yes, very stupid. Lucky for me." The tension broke slightly. Darren found himself almost smiling back. "Lucky for both of us, maybe." The moment stretched between them changed into something warmer, more dangerous. Then a coyote's howl in the distance reminded them both where they were, what they were facing. Darren stepped back, creating distance. "We should eat," he said. "Then I'll take first watch. We could both watch. Take shifts. You need rest. That wound is nearly healed. Stop treating me like I'm about to shatter." She moved to the stove, began dishing out the beans and cornbread she'd prepared. "We share the watch. We share everything now. That's what partners do." Partners. The word sat uncomfortably, reminded him of betrayals past. But she was right. Whether he liked it or not, they were in this together now. That night they sat on opposite sides of the cabin, each taking a window, watching the darkness in 2-hour shifts. When Darren's turn came to rest, he lay on his bedroll listening to Xiao Yue's quiet breathing, the small sounds she made shifting position, the whisper of her clothes against the wood floor. It was strange having another person in his space after so long alone. Strange, but not entirely unpleasant. He woke to her hand on his shoulder, urgent but gentle. Darren, someone's coming. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, sleep falling away like water. How many? I can't tell, maybe 2 riders, from the south. Dawn was just beginning to gray the eastern sky. That uncertain hour when shadows played tricks and distances were hard to judge. Darren moved to the window, peered out carefully. She was right, 2 riders approaching at an easy pace, not trying to hide their presence. Could be legitimate travelers, he said, though his gut told him otherwise. Should we go outside? Show ourselves as before? Darren considered. Not yet. Let's see what they want first. The riders stopped about 50 yards out, close enough to call out, far enough to avoid immediate threat. One of them was Cooper. Darren recognized the heavy build, the cruel eyes even at this distance. The other was new, a lean man with a face like weathered leather. Halt! Cooper's voice carried across the quiet morning. Need to talk to you, just talk. We're not looking for trouble. Then state your business and ride on, Darren called back. Rather discuss it face to face, man to man. Xiao Yue moved beside Darren, her own rifle held with increasing confidence. It's a trap, she whispered. Probably, but if we don't talk, they'll just come back with more men. He made his decision. Stay inside, keep your rifle on them through the window. If shooting starts, you know what to do. Darren, just be ready. He stepped outside, keeping his rifle pointed casually downward, but his finger near the trigger. The morning air was cool, would be for another hour before the sun began its daily punishment. Cooper and his companion dismounted, moved forward a few steps, hands deliberately away from their weapons. That's close enough, Darren said when they were 30 feet away. Cooper stopped, raised his hand slightly in a peaceable gesture that fooled no one. Like I said, just want to talk. Got a proposition for you. Not interested. Haven't heard it yet. Cooper's smile didn't reach his eyes. See, we've been thinking about your situation. You're out here alone, well, mostly alone, on this poor excuse for a ranch. Hard living, dangerous. Man could use some protection, some friends. I don't need friends. Everyone needs friends, Holt, especially when there's trouble brewing in the territory. Cooper's tone became conversational, almost friendly. A lot of violence lately, travelers getting attacked, ranches getting burned. Shame if something like that happened to you. There it was, the threat wrapped in concern. Darren's grip on his rifle tightened slightly. I can take care of myself. Can you? Can that pretty little wife of yours? Cooper let the words hang. Chinese, isn't she? Unusual for these parts, almost like she just appeared recently, right around the time we've been looking for someone. Already told you, she's been here 3 months. You want to see the marriage certificate? It was a bluff. There was no certificate. But Darren delivered it with confidence. The lean man beside Cooper spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. Funny thing about certificates. Paper's cheap, easy to forge, easy to lie about. You calling me a liar? I'm saying we want proof, real proof. Let us talk to the woman, ask her some questions. If she's really your wife like you claim, she won't mind answering. Darren's blood ran cold. They were pushing, testing, trying to force a confrontation. If he refused, it confirmed their suspicions. If he agreed, they'd interrogate Xiao Yue, probably find holes in their hastily constructed story. She's not available for questioning by every drifter who rides up asking. This is private property, and you're wearing out your welcome. Cooper's friendly mask slipped slightly. That's not very neighborly, Holt. We're not neighbors, and I'm done talking. Ride out. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched taut as wire, one spark away from exploding into violence. Darren could feel Xiao Yue watching from the cabin window, could sense her finger on the trigger, waiting for his signal. Then Cooper smiled that cold smile again. All right, we'll go. But Holt, you might want to think about our offer of protection. Things are going to get rough out here real soon. Hate to see anything happen to you or your wife. They mounted their horses with deliberate slowness, never turning their backs, never taking their eyes off Darren. As they rode away, Cooper called back one more time. "We'll be seeing you again real soon. Count on it." Darren stood frozen until they disappeared over the southern ridge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, to lower the rifle, to feel the adrenaline shaking through his muscles. Xiao Yue emerged from the cabin, her face pale but determined. "That was a warning. That was a promise." Darren turned to her. "They know. Maybe not for certain, but enough to be suspicious. And they're not going to stop until they get confirmation one way or another. So what do? We prepare. Because next time they come, it won't be for talking." They spent the rest of that day fortifying the ranch. Darren showed Xiao Yue how to barricade the cabin door and windows, where he'd stored extra ammunition, the escape routes if the cabin became indefensible. They practiced shooting together, her accuracy improving with each round until she could hit targets reliably at 50 yards. "You're a natural," Darren observed, watching her reload with increasing speed. "I'm motivated. Death is excellent motivation." They worked through the afternoon heat, barely stopping for water, driven by the certainty that time was running out. When evening came, they were both exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but the ranch was as prepared as they could make it. That night, neither of them slept. They sat together at the table, rifles within reach, listening to every sound from the darkness outside. An owl's hunting call, the wind shifting through sage, the distant howl of coyotes. Each sound brought them to full alert until they could identify it as harmless. "Tell me something," Xiao Yue said softly around midnight. "If you could go back knowing everything that happened, would you still pick me up in the desert, or would you ride past?" Darren considered the question seriously. His life had been simple before her arrival. Lonely, yes. Empty, perhaps. But safe. Predictable. No complications, no threats, no one to worry about except himself. "I'd pick you up," he said finally. "Even knowing this was coming, I'd still pick you up." "Why?" "Because leaving you would have been the end of something in me, some last piece of humanity I couldn't afford to lose." He met her eyes across the table. "You asked earlier if I live hard enough for two people. Maybe I do. But before you came, I wasn't really living at all, just existing, going through motions. There's a difference." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "When this is over, if we survive, what will you do?" "Haven't thought that far ahead. Think about it now, with me." The implications of those two words, "with me," hung in the air between them. Darren looked down at her hand on his, so much smaller, the fingers still bearing faint scars from her desperate crawl through the desert. This woman who'd lost everything, who should have been broken by it, who instead had somehow found the strength to keep fighting, to keep learning, to keep living with a fierceness that both inspired and humbled him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I stopped making plans when the last ones fell apart. Then we'll figure it out together, day by day, like we've been doing." Before Darren could respond, a sound from outside brought them both to their feet, the unmistakable thunder of multiple horses approaching fast. Not two riders this time. More. Many more. They moved to the windows, peering into the darkness. Torches appeared on the southern ridge, flickering points of light that multiplied as Darren watched. 5, 8, 10. A dozen armed riders carrying fire, descending toward the ranch like a wave of violence made visible. "They're coming," Xiao Yue breathed. "Get the spare ammunition. Bar the back door. Stay low and don't shoot until I tell you." She moved immediately, no hesitation, no panic, just smooth efficiency born of their preparation. Darren felt a surge of fierce pride in her, even as dread settled like ice in his chest. A dozen men, maybe more. Even with two people shooting, the odds were impossible. But he'd survived impossible before. The riders spread out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle around the cabin. They stopped just out of easy rifle range, torches held high, illuminating the night. In the center, mounted on a massive bay horse, sat a man Darren had never seen in person, but recognized instantly from Xiao Yue's description, Garrett Lynch. He was tall, even sitting down, broad-shouldered, with a flowing red-gold beard that caught the torchlight. His black coat was indeed expensive, tailored, completely out of place on the frontier. He looked like a gentleman dressed for dinner, not a raid. The effect was somehow more menacing than if he'd been dressed like his men. "Darren Holt!" Lynch's voice was cultured, educated, with just a trace of Irish accent buried beneath refinement. "I believe we need to have a conversation about property that belongs to me." Darren positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. "I don't have anything of yours." "Oh, but I think you do. A witness. A survivor. A young Chinese woman who saw my face, heard my voice, can identify my men." Lynch leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, I'm a reasonable man. A businessman. So I'm going to make you a very simple offer. Send her out and you live. Keep her inside and you burn with her. You've got 5 minutes to decide." Beside Darren, Xiao Yue had gone completely still, her face drained of color. "He found me. I brought this on you. You should shut up and get ready to shoot," Darren interrupted, "because there's no decision to make. He's not getting you. Darren, there are too many. If I go, you walk out there and you die slow. He'll make sure of it, make an example, and then he'll probably burn my ranch anyway, just for the insult of making him come out here." Darren checked his ammunition, his movements calm despite the hammering of his heart. "We fight. We survive. That's the only option." Lynch's voice carried across the darkness again. "Clock's ticking, Holt. 4 minutes." Xiao Yue moved to the opposite window, her rifle barrel resting on the sill. Her hands were shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Then we fight together, like partners." "Like partners?" Darren agreed. They waited in tense silence, watching the circle of riders, counting weapons, calculating angles. Lynch sat motionless, patient, confident in his overwhelming numbers. He probably thought this would be easy. Probably thought Darren would fold, would make the rational choice to save his own life. He didn't know Darren had already lost everything once before. Didn't know that this worthless ranch and the woman shaking beside him were the only things in 3 years that had made him feel alive again. Didn't know that some men, when pushed to the edge, don't fold. They burn. 3 minutes, Holt! Darren aimed carefully at the nearest torchbearer, steadied his breathing, and waited for Lynch's ultimatum to expire. The seconds stretched like hours, each heartbeat thundering in Darren's ears as he watched Lynch through the rifle sight. The bandit leader sat perfectly still on his bay horse, torchlight dancing across his cultured features, that expensive black coat absorbing the darkness around him. He looked like a man who'd never doubted his own power, never questioned that the world would bend to his will. Men like that were the most dangerous kind, not because they were cruel, though Lynch certainly was, but because they genuinely believed themselves entitled to whatever they wanted to take. 2 minutes, Lynch called out, his voice carrying the same casual tone someone might use to discuss weather or livestock prices. "I'm a patient man, Holt, but even my patience has limits." Darren's finger rested lightly on the trigger. Beside him, Xiao Yue had positioned herself at the opposite window, her rifle trained on a different section of the semicircle. She'd stopped shaking, he noticed. Her hands were steady now, her breathing controlled. Whatever fear she felt had been locked down, compressed into something harder, more useful. He recognized that transformation, had felt it himself in moments when survival demanded you become something other than afraid. "If we shoot first," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving her targets, "we lose any chance of them leaving peacefully." There was never a chance of them leaving peacefully. Lynch didn't ride out here with 12 men and torches to have a conversation. He came to kill us. The only question is whether we make it easy or hard. Then we make it hard. Something in her voice, that fierce certainty, made Darren glance at her profile. The torchlight from outside cast her face in sharp relief, all elegant angles and determined jaw. She looked like a warrior in that moment, like something out of the stories she'd told her little brother about dragons and heroes. The scared refugee who'd collapsed in his desert was gone. In her place stood someone forged by loss and desperation into something unbreakable. 1 minute, Holt! Lynch's patience was fraying now, irritation creeping into his cultured voice. "I'll ask one more time. Send out the woman and walk away from this. That's more mercy than most men in your position would get." Darren made his decision. He'd known what it would be from the moment Lynch appeared on that ridge, but there was still a finality in committing to it. He shifted his aim slightly, targeting not Lynch. Killing the leader first would just enrage the others, but the torchbearer directly to Lynch's right. "When I shoot," he told Xiao Yue. You take the one on the far left, then we reload and pick targets as they come. Don't think, don't hesitate, just shoot. I understand. And Xiao Yue? Whatever happens, you did not bring this on me. This choice is mine. You hear me? Mine. She nodded once, sharp and quick, then returned her focus to her target. The last seconds ticked away in silence, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses outside and the occasional crackle of torches. Lynch sat motionless, waiting for Darren's answer, probably certain he already knew what it would be. Men like Lynch understood fear. They built their power on it, used it like a tool. What they rarely understood was the kind of desperation that went beyond fear into something colder and more absolute. Time's up, Lynch said. Last chance, Holt. Darren's response was a rifle shot that punched through the night like thunder. The torchbearer to Lynch's right jerked backward, his torch flying from his hand as he toppled from his saddle. Before his body hit the ground, Xiao Yue's rifle cracked, and the torchbearer on the far left fell as well, his torch tumbling into the dry brush where it began to smolder and catch. For one frozen instant, chaos hung suspended. Lynch's horse reared, spooked by the sudden violence. The remaining riders fought to control their mounts while simultaneously reaching for weapons. Someone was shouting, the words lost in the sudden cacophony of men and horses and gunfire. Then the night exploded. Darren fired again, reloaded with the mechanical efficiency of muscle memory, fired again. He wasn't aiming for kills now, that would come if it came, but for disruption, for breaking up their formation, for making them scatter instead of charging in an organized assault. A bullet punched through a rider's shoulder. Another hit someone's horse, sending it bucking wildly and throwing its rider into the dirt. Xiao Yue fired with deliberate precision, each shot carefully placed. She hit a man reaching for his rifle, the impact spinning him sideways, hit another's horse, forcing it to wheel away in panic. Her reload was slower than Darren's, but still steady, her hands moving through the motions he'd taught her with determined focus. Lynch had regained control of his mount and was shouting orders, trying to impose order on the confusion. Spread out, circle the cabin, don't bunch up, you idiots. His cultured voice had turned harsh, all pretense of civility stripped away by rage and surprise. The riders scattered as commanded, some wheeling left, others right, creating multiple angles of attack. Darren swore under his breath. Lynch was smart, experienced. He'd recovered from the initial shock faster than Darren had hoped. A bullet slammed into the cabin wall inches from Darren's head, sending splinters flying. He ducked instinctively, then returned fire at the muzzle flash, heard a satisfying cry of pain. But there were too many angles now, too many shooters. Bullets were coming from the left, the right, punching through the thin cabin walls, thudding into the roof timbers. Get down! Darren shouted to Xiao Yue as a bullet shattered the window frame above her head. She dropped below the sill, pressed her back against the wall, breathing hard. They're surrounding us. I know. Stay low. Only shoot when you have a clear target. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and dust kicked up by bullets tearing through wood. Outside, the dropped torches had ignited patches of dry grass, creating dancing pools of light that illuminated some attackers while throwing others into deeper shadow. The smoke from the small fires began to drift, making it harder to see, harder to aim. Darren moved to the back window, checking for riders approaching from that direction. Sure enough, two men were dismounting, using the darkness and smoke as cover to creep closer. He fired twice in quick succession, forcing them to dive for cover behind a water trough. It wouldn't hold them long, but every second counted. A different sound cut through the gunfire, the whinnying scream of an injured horse. One of the dropped torches had set a rider's mount on fire, the poor animal thrashing in agony and panic. The rider tried to control it, got thrown, and was trampled by another horse fleeing the flames. The scene was descending into chaos, fire and smoke and frightened animals mixing with the violence into something nightmare-like. Lynch's voice rose above the confusion, still trying to maintain control. Hold positions. Don't let them make you panic. It's 2 people against 12. We have them. But it wasn't 12 anymore, Darren noted with grim satisfaction. 2 down from his initial shots. 1 thrown and trampled. At least 3 more wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. The odds were improving, though still heavily against them. A bullet punched through the wall near the stove, and Darren heard Xiao Yue gasp. He spun toward her. You hit? No, close, but no. She'd moved to a different window, was returning fire at someone Darren couldn't see from his angle. But they're getting closer! She was right. Lynch's men were using the smoke and confusion to advance, moving from cover to cover, tightening the noose. Another few minutes and they'd be close enough to rush the cabin, and then it would become a matter of overwhelming numbers in close quarters. Darren's mind raced through options. They could retreat to the back room, create a fallback position, but that would just delay the inevitable. They could try to make a run for the horses, but they'd be cut down before they made it 10 feet. They needed something to break the pattern, to change the dynamic of the fight. His eyes fell on the oil lamp hanging from a roof beam. Xiao Yue, the spare lamp oil, where is it? The shelf near the stove, why? Get it, and find me any cloth you can, old shirts, rags, anything. She moved immediately, trusting him without question. While she gathered materials, Darren provided covering fire, shooting at any movement he could see through the smoke. The attackers were being more cautious now, had learned that rushing in got you killed, but they were still advancing, still tightening the circle. Xiao Yue returned with a jug of lamp oil and an armful of old cloth. What are you thinking? Something stupid and dangerous. Help me soak these. They worked together quickly, dampening the cloth strips with oil. Darren stuffed the oiled rags into 3 empty bottles, leaving cloth wicks hanging out. Improvised firebombs. He'd seen them used during a range war years ago, knew how devastating they could be. When I light these and throw them, they're going to illuminate everything, he told Xiao Yue. That means they'll see us clearly, but we'll also see them. Be ready to shoot fast. She nodded, checking her ammunition. She was down to maybe a dozen rounds, he saw. He wasn't much better off. This had to work or they'd be overrun. Darren lit the first bottle's wick from the stove's fire, moved to the front window and hurled it toward the cluster of riders on the left side of the semicircle. The bottle arced through the smoky darkness, trailing fire, then shattered against a rock near 2 dismounted riders. Flames exploded outward, engulfing both men in burning oil. Their screams cut through the night, high and terrible. One of them managed to run a few steps before collapsing. The other rolled on the ground trying to extinguish himself, but the oil clung like liquid fire. The effect on the other attackers was immediate and visceral. Men who'd been advancing stopped dead, faced with the horrifying reality of burning alive. Someone shouted in panic. Another rider wheeled his horse around, clearly reconsidering whether this fight was worth dying for. Darren lit the second bottle, threw it toward the right side. This one caught a horse, sent it screaming and bucking through the line of attackers, spreading panic. Men scattered to avoid the burning animal, their formation breaking completely. Lynch was still shouting orders, but even his cultured voice couldn't overcome the primal terror fire inspired. The third bottle Darren threw directly at Lynch himself, aiming not to kill, but to force him back, to break his control over his men. Lynch saw it coming, spurred his horse backward. The bottle exploded where he'd been seconds before, creating a wall of flame between him and the cabin. Through the fire and smoke, Darren saw Lynch's face twisted with rage, saw him raising his rifle to return fire. "Get down!" Darren shouted, but he was already moving, tackling Xiao Yue to the floor as Lynch's shot tore through the exact space where she'd been standing. They hit the rough floorboards hard, Darren's body covering hers protectively. Bullets from multiple directions punched through the walls above them, the cabin becoming a death trap as the remaining attackers unleashed everything they had. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. They could do nothing but press themselves flat, while wood splintered and shattered around them. Darren felt something hot graze his shoulder. A bullet or flying debris, he couldn't tell, but ignored it. Beside him, Xiao Yue had her arms wrapped around her head, her body rigid with tension. Then, as suddenly as it had intensified, the gunfire slackened, stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames and the labored breathing of injured men. Darren risked raising his head, peering through the smoke-filled cabin toward the windows. The fires from the thrown bottles were burning themselves out, but they'd done their work. The semicircle of attackers had disintegrated. Some had retreated to safer distances. Others were tending to wounded companions. At least 2 more were down and not moving. And Lynch was still there, still on his bay horse, but he'd pulled back beyond effective rifle range. Even through the smoke and dancing shadows, Darren could see the calculation in his posture, The way he sat perfectly still, reassessing. Is it over? Xiao Yue whispered. Not yet, but we hurt them. Made them pay a price they weren't expecting. They climbed slowly to their feet, checking themselves for injuries. Darren's shoulder was bleeding where a splinter had gouged a line through his shirt, but it was superficial. Xiao Yue had a cut above her eyebrow from flying wood, but otherwise seemed unharmed. The cabin, however, was a wreck. The walls were riddled with bullet holes. One window frame had been completely shot away. The door hung crooked on damaged hinges. Darren's few possessions were scattered and destroyed. 3 years of solitary life demolished in minutes. But they were alive. Lynch's voice cut through the smoke. Different now, harder. Impressive, Holt. You're tougher than I gave you credit for. But this isn't over. Not even close. Darren moved to the window, rifle ready despite having only a handful of rounds left. Then come finish it, Lynch. What are you waiting for? I'm waiting for you to realize you can't win. Look around. Your cabin's destroyed. You're almost out of ammunition. I can tell by how carefully you're shooting now. And I've still got 8 men standing, 8 against 2. Lynch paused, letting that sink in. But I'm going to make you one final offer, because despite everything, I respect a man who fights for what's his. I don't want your offer. You'll want this one. Ride out, right now. Take a horse and leave. I give you my word as a gentleman, that you'll make it safely away. Go start over somewhere else. All I want is the woman. Beside Darren, Xiao Yue had gone very still. Don't, she said quietly. Don't even consider it. I'm not, Darren replied, but part of him, the calculating, survival-focused part that had kept him alive through betrayal and isolation, was considering it, was weighing the impossible odds against one slim chance at escape. She's not even really your wife, Lynch continued, his voice almost reasonable now, almost kind. You've known her what, a week? Less? She's nothing to you, just some Chinese refugee who brought death to your door. Why die for her? Why throw away your life for a stranger? It was a good question, the logical question, the kind of question Darren had built his entire isolated existence around. Don't get involved. Don't care. Don't sacrifice yourself for anyone else's problems. He looked at Xiao Yue. She was staring back at him, her dark eyes reflecting firelight, her face streaked with soot and blood and tears she refused to let fall. Waiting. Not asking him to stay, not pleading or begging, just waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be in this moment. You're wrong, Lynch, Darren called back. She's not nothing to me. He saw something shift in Xiao Yue's expression, surprise, relief, something deeper he couldn't name. Lynch's voice turned cold again. Then you're a fool, and you'll die a fool's death. We'll wait you out. Sooner or later, you'll run out of ammunition, out of water, out of options. And when you do, I'll burn what's left of that cabin to the ground with both of you inside it. You're welcome to try. Lynch turned his horse, preparing to withdraw to a safer distance. But before he could move, Cooper, bleeding from a shoulder wound but still in his saddle, shouted from the darkness. Why are we waiting? They got nothing left. We can rush them right now. I said hold position, Lynch snapped. We do this smart, not smart? We already lost 5 men to these 2. How many more are you willing to lose? The other riders were listening now, Darren realized, some of them nodding in agreement with Cooper. They'd come expecting an easy fight, and instead had been bloodied, burned, made to look like fools. Their pride was demanding vengeance, overwhelming their leader's caution. Lynch knew it too. Darren could see the moment he lost control of his men, could see the calculation shift from patient siege to desperate need to maintain authority. All right, Lynch said, his voice carrying across the smoking battlefield. All right. Cooper's right. We finish this now. Everyone who can ride, prepare to charge on my signal. We hit them from all sides at once. They can't defend every direction. Darren's stomach dropped. This was it then. The final assault. 8 men rushing the cabin simultaneously, while he and Xiao Yue had maybe 20 rounds of ammunition between them. How many bullets do you have left? He asked Xiao Yue without taking his eyes off the gathering riders. 7, maybe 8. I've got 12. Not enough. Then we make them count. They positioned themselves at opposite windows again, rifles ready, both knowing with absolute certainty that the next few minutes would decide everything. Either they survived this impossible assault, or they died together in this wrecked cabin that had once been Darren's fortress of solitude. Lynch raised his hand, preparing to signal the charge. The riders bunched together, ready to explode into motion. Horses snorted and stamped, sensing the violence to come. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a new sound emerged. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast from the north. Lynch hesitated, his hand still raised. The sound grew louder. 4 riders, maybe 5, coming hard. Everyone froze, trying to understand this new element, this unexpected complication. The riders burst into the firelight, and Darren felt hope flare for the first time in hours. One wore a sheriff's badge that caught the flames glow. The sheriff and his deputies pulled up between Lynch's men in the cabin, effectively cutting off the planned assault. The sheriff was an older man, iron-gray beard, hard eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to be impressed by it anymore. "Garrett Lynch," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You and your men are going to lower your weapons and dismount, right now." Lynch's expression flickered between rage and calculation. "Sheriff Tompkins, bit outside your jurisdiction, aren't you?" "Jurisdiction extends to wherever I'm pursuing known criminals. And you, Lynch, have just become very wanted. Telegraph came through yesterday. Seems a wounded Chinese merchant in Denver survived your attack on his caravan. Gave detailed descriptions, named names." Tompkins gestured to his deputies who'd fanned out with rifles ready. "Federal marshals are offering $5,000 for you, dead or alive." The words hit like thunder. Darren saw Lynch's face go white, saw his men exchanging glances, saw the mathematics of loyalty being rapidly recalculated against the promise of reward money. "That merchant was dead," Lynch said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "I saw him shot." "Apparently you didn't see well enough. He lived long enough to talk. Long enough to make you and your whole operation famous from here to California." Tompkins shifted in his saddle. "Now, I'll say it one more time. Lower your weapons and dismount, or my deputies start shooting and we collect that reward money the easy way." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Lynch sat frozen, probably running through scenarios, calculating odds. Then Cooper, still bleeding from his shoulder, did something that changed everything. He raised his rifle toward Tompkins. The deputies shot him before he could pull the trigger. Cooper jerked backward, tumbled from his horse, hit the ground, and didn't move. The other riders scattered instantly, the fragile cohesion of Lynch's gang disintegrating. Some spurred their horses and fled into the darkness. Others threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Within seconds, organized resistance collapsed into chaos and panic. Lynch himself wheeled his bay horse and kicked it into a dead run, heading south, abandoning his wounded, his dead, his entire operation in a desperate bid to escape. "After him!" Tompkins shouted, and 2 deputies gave chase. Darren sagged against the cabin wall, his legs suddenly weak. Beside him, Xiao Yue lowered her rifle with trembling hands, her face slack with shocked relief. "We're alive," she whispered. "We're actually alive." Tompkins approached the cabin, keeping his rifle ready but pointed safely down. "You folks all right in there?" Darren stepped out into the smoky ruins of his yard, Xiao Yue close behind him. "We're alive. That's about all I can say." The sheriff looked them over. 2 people covered in soot and blood standing in front of a cabin that looked like it had survived a war. "Heard the shooting from 5 miles out, came as fast as we could." His eyes settled on Xiao Yue. "You the survivor Lynch was looking for?" She nodded, too exhausted for words. "Well, you picked one hell of a place to make a stand." Tompkins turned to survey the battlefield, dead and wounded men, frightened horses, smoldering fires. "This is going to take some sorting out. You 2 feel up to giving statements?" "Tomorrow," Darren said. His shoulder was starting to throb where the splinter had cut him. His whole body felt like one massive bruise. "Right now, we just need to rest." Tompkins nodded. "Fair enough. My men will round up the survivors, tend to the wounded, collect the dead. You 2 get inside, get cleaned up." He paused. "That was brave what you did. Stupid maybe, but brave. Not many men would stand against Lynch's whole gang for a stranger." "She's not a stranger," Darren said, meeting Xiao Yue's eyes. "She's my wife." And saying it out loud, with no pretense, no lie, no desperate fiction for survival, Darren realized it felt true in a way it hadn't before. Somewhere between the first gunshot and the last, somewhere between fear and defiance, the pretend marriage had become something real. Xiao Yue's eyes widened slightly, searching his face for meaning. Then she slipped her hand into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "Yes," she said softly, "his wife." Sheriff Tompkins and his deputies worked through the night, their torches creating pools of shifting light across the battlefield that had been Darren's ranch. The sounds of their activity drifted through the bullet-riddled cabin walls, the jingle of chains as they shackled prisoners, low voices conferring over wounded men, the occasional whinny of gathered horses. Darren and Xiao Yue sat inside at the damaged table, too exhausted to do more than exist in the aftermath of violence, listening to the cleanup of carnage they'd survived. Xiao Yue had tried to clean the blood from Darren's shoulder wound, her hand shaking so badly she'd dropped the cloth twice before he'd gently taken it from her and done it himself. Now she sat across from him, staring at her own hands as though she didn't quite recognize them. The hands that had loaded rifles, that had pulled triggers, that had helped kill men tonight. "I shot someone," she said suddenly, her voice hollow. "Maybe more than one. I aimed and I fired and I watched them fall. You did what you had to do to survive. Does it always feel like this after? Like your skin doesn't fit right anymore? Like you left something important behind in the smoke?" Darren knew exactly what she meant. He'd felt it the first time he'd killed a man, years ago during a dispute over water rights that had turned deadly. That sense of having crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, of becoming someone fundamentally different in an instant. "Yes," he said honestly. "It feels like that. And tomorrow it'll feel different, and the day after that different again. Eventually you learn to carry it, but it never quite goes away." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "I don't want to carry it. I don't want to be someone who kills." "Then you should have let them take you, should have walked out there when Lynch gave you the chance." His words were harsh, but his tone was gentle. "But you didn't. You chose to fight. You chose to live. And that choice has a cost." "Was it worth it? The cost?" Darren reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "Ask me tomorrow when we're both still breathing, when the sun comes up and we're here to see it. Then tell me if survival was worth the price." Before she could respond, Tompkins appeared in the damaged doorway, his expression grim. "Got the prisoners secured. 5 wounded, 3 dead out there. 2 more probably won't make it till morning. Cooper's among the dead." He removed his hat, turned it in his hands. "And we found Lynch." Darren felt Xiao Yue tense beside him. "Found him how?" "Dead. Horse threw him about 2 miles south, broke his neck in the fall. My deputies found his body in a ravine." Tompkins' expression was unreadable. Fitting end for a man like that, running away, dying alone in the dark. Xiao Yue's breath caught. "Then it's truly over? He can't come back?" "He can't come back, and his gang's finished. The ones who ran won't dare show their faces, not with federal warrants out and every lawman in the territory hunting them." Tompkins settled his hat back on his head. "You're safe now, ma'am. Both of you." The word should have brought relief, but Darren felt only a strange emptiness. He'd spent days preparing for this fight, had built his entire recent existence around the certainty of violence coming. Now that it was over, won through a combination of desperate fighting and impossible luck, he didn't know what to feel. Tompkins studied them both for a moment. "There'll be questions tomorrow. Official statements, paperwork for the federal marshals. But for tonight, get some rest. You've both earned it." He paused at the door. "And Holt? What you did here, standing against Lynch's whole gang to protect your wife. That took real courage. Not many men have that kind of steel." After the sheriff left, Darren and Xiao Yue sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd survived. The cabin creaked around them, damaged timber settling, night wind whistling through bullet holes. It would take weeks to repair the damage, Darren thought distantly. Maybe months. He'd need new window frames, new door, half the wall boards replaced. "I should check the horses," he said finally, needing movement, needing to do something practical and concrete. "Make sure they're all right after all the shooting." "I'll come with you." They walked out together into the cool night air that tasted of smoke and gunpowder and blood. The deputies had gathered the surviving attackers' horses into Darren's corral alongside his own animals. The gelding whinnied when it saw Darren, clearly agitated by the night's events but unharmed. Darren ran his hands along the horse's neck, checking for injuries, letting the familiar routine calm his jangled nerves. Xiao Yue moved among the other horses with surprising confidence, her fear of the large animals apparently overcome by everything else she'd faced tonight. She paused beside a beautiful gray mare that had belonged to one of Lynch's men. "This one's hurt," she called softly. "Her leg." Darren joined her, examined the mare's front left leg, found it swollen and hot to the touch. Probably strained when her rider had dismounted in panic. "She'll need rest and cold compresses. Might heal, might not. What happens to her if she doesn't heal?" The practical answer, that a lame horse was usually destroyed, died on Darren's lips when he saw Xiao Yue's expression. She was stroking the mare's neck with gentle hands, her face a mixture of exhaustion and desperate tenderness. After all the death tonight, she needed something to save. "We'll do what we can for her," Darren said. "Give her time. See if she recovers." Xiao Yue looked at him with such gratitude that something shifted in his chest. This woman who'd killed men hours ago was now nearly in tears over a wounded horse. The contradiction should have been jarring, but instead it felt perfectly natural. That was what survival did. It forced you to become hard enough to fight and soft enough to still care about the aftermath. They worked together in comfortable silence, checking each horse, providing water, distributing feed from Darren's limited supplies. The deputies watched from a distance, giving them space, perhaps recognizing their need to do something normal, something life-affirming after the violence. When they finally returned to the cabin, dawn was beginning to gray the eastern horizon. The night had passed in a blur of adrenaline and survival and impossible choices. Now morning was coming, and with it the reality of what lay ahead. Xiao Yue stopped in the doorway, surveying the destroyed interior by the growing light. "Your home. I ruined your home." "My home was already ruined. Had been for 3 years, I just didn't want to admit it." Darren moved past her, began gathering the scattered remains of his possessions. "A building isn't a home. It's just walls and a roof. I know that now." "Then what makes it a home?" He looked at her standing there in the damaged doorway, backlit by dawn, her borrowed clothes torn and bloody, her face streaked with soot, her eyes holding questions she was almost afraid to ask. And he realized the answer had been forming for days, perhaps from the moment he'd chosen to pick her up in the desert instead of riding past. "Having someone worth coming back to," he said quietly. "Having someone worth fighting for. Worth rebuilding for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to name directly. Xiao Yue stepped fully inside, closed what remained of the door behind her. "Darren, when you told the sheriff I was your wife, I meant it. But we barely know each other. 1 week ago, I was a stranger collapsing in your desert. You don't owe me marriage. Don't owe me anything beyond the help you've already given." "This isn't about owing. This is about—" Darren struggled to articulate feelings he'd kept locked away for years. "When I lost everything before, when my partner betrayed me and took my ranch, I thought the lesson was to never trust anyone again. To never let anyone close enough to hurt me. I built this place, lived alone, told myself I was fine." He gestured at the bullet-riddled walls. "But I wasn't fine. I was just existing, going through motions. Then you arrived and everything changed. Because I brought danger and excitement?" Her tone was almost bitter. "Because fighting for my life made you feel alive again?" "No. Because for the first time in 3 years, I had something to protect that mattered more than just survival. Someone whose life meant more to me than my own." He moved closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. "You asked me once if I'd pick you up again knowing what would happen. I said yes, but what I should have said was thank you. Thank you for destroying your home, for nearly getting you killed, for reminding me what it feels like to care about someone, to trust someone, to be trusted by someone." He reached up, gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You could have run a dozen times, could have left me to face Lynch alone. But you stayed. You fought beside me. You became my partner in the truest sense." Xiao Yue caught his hand, held it against her face. "I stayed because leaving you would have destroyed something in me. The same thing that would have been destroyed if you'd ridden past me in the desert." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I lost my entire family, everyone I loved. And then I found you, found this, found something worth surviving for. So what do we do now? Darren asked, though he thought he knew the answer, hoped he knew it. We rebuild. Together. Not pretending anymore. Not hiding behind lies about fake marriages. She managed a tremulous smile through her tears. We make it real. Darren pulled her into his arms, felt her body shake with exhaustion and relief, and something deeper. She wrapped her arms around him, buried her face against his chest, and for the first time since the shooting started, truly let herself break down. Great racking sobs shook her small frame as all the fear and grief and desperate courage finally found release. He held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed against her back, keeping her grounded as the storm of emotion worked through her. And standing there in his destroyed cabin, surrounded by the evidence of violence survived, Darren felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Outside, Tompkins and his deputies began the process of transporting prisoners and bodies back to the settlement for trial and burial. Inside the cabin, Darren and Xiaoyue finally allowed themselves to rest, sitting together on his bedroll, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them too exhausted for anything but proximity. Tell me about the ranch you lost, Xiaoyue said softly. The one before this? Why? Because I want to know you, all of you, not just the man who saved me, but the man you were before, the man you might become again. So Darren told her about the beautiful valley land with good water and better grass, about the partner named James who'd seemed like a brother for 5 years before the betrayal, about the woman named Catherine who'd promised to marry Darren but chose James instead when the money and property went his way, about the bitter lesson in trust and the long, lonely years that followed. Xiaoyue listened without judgment, her hand finding his and holding tight. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. My father used to say that jade is worthless until it's broken and remade, that the finest jade comes from pieces that have been shattered and reforged stronger. She shifted to look up at him. Maybe we're both broken jade, and maybe we're meant to be remade together. That's a better story than mine about becoming stone. Stone breaks under enough pressure, but jade with gold seams, that's called kintsukuroi in Japanese. The art of mending broken things with gold, making them more beautiful than before. She traced a finger along the cut on his shoulder. We're both broken, but maybe together we can be beautiful. Darren had never thought of himself as beautiful, had never imagined his scars and failures as anything but ugly reminders of all he'd lost. But looking at this woman who'd survived massacre and desert and gunfire, who'd somehow found strength he hadn't known existed, he began to understand what she meant. They were both damaged, both scarred, both carrying losses that would never fully heal. But together, they were something new, something forged in shared survival and desperate trust and the kind of partnership that only emerged when two people chose to stand together against impossible odds. When the sheriff comes back, Darren said, when he asks for our statements, he's going to want to know about our marriage, whether it's legal, whether we have documentation. And what will you tell him? The truth. That we claimed to be married to protect you from lynch, that it started as a lie of necessity. He paused, met her eyes directly. And then I'll ask him where the nearest preacher or magistrate is, because I want to make it legal, make it real. If you'll have me, Xiaoyue's breath caught. Are you asking? I'm asking if you'll marry me. Truly. Not because of bandits or danger or desperate survival, but because I want to build a life with you, here on this worthless piece of desert that somehow became home the moment you arrived. He pulled her closer. I'm asking if you'll take a broken man with a destroyed cabin and turn it into something worth having. She was crying again, but smiling through the tears. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll help you rebuild this cabin. I'll learn to cook on that impossible stove and mend your clothes and shoot rifles at anyone who threatens what's ours. She laughed, a sound of pure joy breaking through the exhaustion. I'll be your wife in truth, not in pretense. Darren kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted of smoke and salt and promise. When they pulled apart, the sun was fully up, streaming through the bullet holes in the walls like tiny shafts of gold, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "We should sleep," Xiao Yue murmured, "before the sheriff returns with his questions." They lay down together on the bedroll, curled into each other, too tired to care about propriety or what anyone might think. Within minutes, Xiao Yue's breathing had evened into sleep, her body finally relaxing after days of constant tension. Darren stayed awake a bit longer, watching her sleep, marveling at the strange path that had led them here. A week ago, he'd been alone, convinced solitude was safety. Now he held in his arms a woman he barely knew, but somehow understood completely. A woman who'd seen him at his worst and his best and chosen to stay. A woman who'd fought beside him with courage that humbled him. A woman he was going to marry. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first truly right decision he'd made in 3 years. When Tompkins returned at midday with his deputies, he found them still sleeping, exhausted beyond the capacity to wake. The sheriff took one look at them curled together on the bedroll and quietly withdrew, leaving orders with his men not to disturb them until evening. Some kinds of rest, he knew, were sacred. They woke as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, groggy and stiff from sleeping on the hard floor, but more rested than either had been in days. Xiao Yue immediately tried to start making food, but Darren stopped her, insisted she continue resting while he handled it. She protested weakly before accepting, watching him work at the stove with eyes that held warmth and wonder. "You're different," she observed. "Since last night, something changed." Everything changed. Darren measured coffee grounds into the battered pot. "Including me. I spent 3 years trying to bury the man I used to be, the one who trusted and cared and built things with other people. Thought he was dead." He looked at her. "Turns out he was just waiting for the right reason to come back." "And what reason was that?" "You, us, this." He gestured at the destroyed cabin, at the evidence of battle survived, at the future stretching before them uncertain but no longer empty. Having something worth fighting for again, something worth rebuilding for. They ate together in comfortable silence, and when Tompkins finally knocked on the damaged doorframe, they were ready to face the questions, the paperwork, the official accounting of the night's violence. The sheriff's statement-taking was thorough but not unkind. He recorded Xiao Yue's account of the caravan attack, her escape, her arrival at Darren's ranch, Darren's decision to help her, the pretend marriage, Lynch's siege, and the desperate fight that followed. Through it all, Tompkins listened with the weary patience of a man who'd heard too many frontier tragedies, taking notes in careful handwriting. "The federal marshals will want to speak with you both," Tompkins said when they finished. "Particularly you, ma'am, since you're a witness to Lynch's crimes. But that can wait a few days. You've been through enough." He closed his notebook. "There's the matter of the reward money, $5,000 for Lynch. That'll be split among my deputies and yourselves, seeing as how you're the ones who kept him pinned here until we arrived." Darren started to refuse. Blood money felt wrong somehow, but Xiao Yue placed a hand on his arm. "We accept," she said firmly. "We'll need it to rebuild, to start over properly." Tompkins nodded approval. "Smart thinking. Should be enough to repair this cabin and then some." He stood to leave, then paused. "One more thing. You mentioned claiming to be married for protection. I assume that was purely tactical?" Darren and Xiao Yue exchanged glances. "It started that way," Darren admitted, "but we're making it real, as soon as we can find someone to perform a ceremony." A slow smile crossed Tompkins' weathered face. "Well then, congratulations. Though if you're looking for someone to officiate, I'm legally authorized. Performed plenty of frontier marriages in my time. Could do yours right now if you'd like. Save you the trip to town." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and perfect. Xiao Yue looked to Darren, question in her eyes. He nodded. "We'd like that," he said. "Very much." Tompkins called in his deputies as witnesses, and there in the bullet-riddled cabin, as evening light painted everything gold, Sheriff Tompkins married Darren Holt and Xiao Yue in a brief ceremony that held more truth than most elaborate weddings. They had no rings, no fancy clothes, no gathered family to witness. Just two people who'd survived hell together and chosen to face whatever came next as partners. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Tompkins said with genuine warmth. "You may kiss your bride." Darren did, gently and reverently, while the deputies applauded and Xiao Yue cried happy tears that mixed with his own. When the sheriff and his men finally departed, Leading their prisoners and their stories back to civilization, Darren and Xiaoyue stood together in the doorway of their damaged cabin, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire and gold. "What now?" Xiaoyue asked, leaning against her husband. "Now we rebuild." "The cabin first, then the barn, then everything else that needs fixing." Darren pulled her closer. "We build a real home. Together. And after that we live. We work this land, raise horses maybe, make something good from all this destruction." He turned to face her fully. "We prove that broken things can be mended, that people who've lost everything can still build something worth having." Xiaoyue stood on her toes and kissed him softly. "Then let's start tonight. Let's start building our future right now." They returned inside, and despite the exhaustion, despite the damage surrounding them, they began the work of transformation, clearing debris, planning repairs, making lists of materials needed, small practical steps toward the larger goal of turning a destroyed cabin into a home. As night fell and they lit the oil lamp, Xiaoyue retrieved something from where she'd hidden it. Her grandmother's silk robe, torn and stained but still beautiful in its own way. She spread it carefully on the table. "I thought I'd lost everything of my past," she said softly. "But maybe I don't need to lose it. Maybe I can bring it with me into this new life. Keep the good parts, honor the memories, while building something new." Darren understood what she meant. His own past, the betrayal, the loss, the years of isolation, didn't have to define him anymore. It could simply be part of his story, the difficult chapters that led him here, to this moment, to this woman, to this new beginning. "We'll hang it somewhere," he decided, "when the cabin's repaired, a reminder of where you came from and what you survived." She smiled, radiant despite the exhaustion still evident in her features. "Our first decoration, a symbol of surviving impossible things." They worked until they could barely keep their eyes open, then collapsed together on the bedroll, husband and wife in truth now, partners in the deepest sense. Tomorrow would bring challenges, repairs to coordinate, materials to acquire, questions from federal marshals to answer. But tonight they simply existed together, alive and whole, and building toward a future that neither had imagined possible just days before. As sleep claimed them, Darren's last conscious thought was of gratitude, for impossible luck, for sheriffs arriving at the perfect moment, for a woman brave enough to fight beside him and gentle enough to mend his broken heart, for the chance to become, once again, the man he'd thought was lost forever. The morning after their wedding arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only follows storms, both the kind made of gunpowder and the kind that live in human hearts. Darren woke to find Xiaoyue already up, standing in the damaged doorway, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of pink and gold. She'd changed into her own clothes again, the practical frontier garments they'd modified together, but she'd pinned a small piece of the red silk from her grandmother's robe to her collar, like a badge of honor. "You're up early," he said, joining her. "Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." She leaned against him when he wrapped an arm around her waist. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream. The fight, the survival, you." She turned to look up at him. "Especially you. I'm real enough. Sore and covered in bruises, but real." She touched the bandage on his shoulder where the splinter had gouged him. "We should change this. Make sure it's not infected." They spent the early morning tending to each other's wounds with a tenderness that felt sacred somehow. Every careful touch, every gentle cleaning of cuts and scrapes was a kind of conversation without words. Darren found himself noticing details he'd been too exhausted or too frightened to see before. The elegant curve of her neck, the determined set of her jaw, the way her hands moved with unconscious grace, even performing mundane tasks. "What are you staring at?" she asked, catching him watching her. "My wife. I'm allowed to stare at my wife." The word still felt new in his mouth, strange and wonderful. Xiaoyue smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her whole face into something luminous. "Your wife," she repeated, testing the words herself. "I like the sound of that. Even though yesterday I couldn't have told you my future would include marrying a stubborn rancher in a bullet-riddled cabin." "Stubborn?" "Very stubborn. You refused to leave me in the desert, refused to send me away when the danger came, refused to abandon me even when it would have saved your life." She finished tying the fresh bandage, Stubborn and brave and impossibly good. I'm not good, just selfish. I kept you because I needed you. Then we're both selfish, because I stayed for the same reason. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Darren's hand went instinctively to his rifle before he recognized the riders. Sheriff Tompkins returning with 2 men in federal marshal badges and a wagon loaded with building supplies. "Thought you could use some help," Tompkins called out as they dismounted. "The marshals here need your statements, and I figured while they're talking, my deputies and I could start on repairs. Least we can do after you help bring down Lynch's gang." The next several hours passed in organized chaos. While the federal marshals, a stern older man named Wallace and a younger, more sympathetic one called Reed, questioned Xiao Yue about the caravan attack, Darren worked alongside Tompkins and his deputies to assess the cabin's damage. The marshals were thorough but not cruel, clearly recognizing the trauma Xiao Yue had endured. Reed in particular seemed moved by her story, his professional demeanor cracking when she described hiding under rice bags while her family was slaughtered. "You've been incredibly brave, Mrs. Holt," Reed said when they finished. "Your testimony will ensure the survivors of Lynch's gang face justice, and the federal government is prepared to offer you compensation for your family's losses." Xiao Yue shook her head. "No amount of money brings them back, but if it helps ensure no other families suffer the same fate, then I'll testify wherever needed." Marshal Wallace nodded approval. "You'll need to appear in Denver in 3 weeks for the trial of the surviving gang members. The government will cover your travel expenses, and you're welcome to bring your husband as support." After the marshals departed with their documented statements and promises of future compensation, Darren and Xiao Yue joined the repair efforts. Tompkins had brought good timber, new glass for windows, proper tools. Working together, they began the transformation of the destroyed cabin into something that could be home again. Xiao Yue proved surprisingly adept at construction work, learning quickly how to measure and cut boards, how to hammer nails straight, how to mix mortar for chinking gaps. The deputies treated her with respectful friendliness, impressed by her willingness to work alongside them without complaint. "Your wife's tougher than most men I know," Tompkins observed to Darren during a water break. "You're a lucky man." "Don't I know it?" By the time the sun reached its zenith, they'd replaced the shattered door and 2 window frames. The work was good, physical and purposeful, turning destruction into creation. Darren found himself laughing at something one of the deputies said, realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed freely. 3 years of isolation had nearly made him forget how. They broke for a simple lunch that Xiao Yue prepared with the limited supplies available: salt pork, beans, coffee, strong enough to strip paint. The deputies praised her cooking with genuine enthusiasm, and Darren watched her bloom under the appreciation, watched her remember what it felt like to be part of a community instead of running from violence. As the afternoon wore on and the repairs progressed, neighbors Darren had barely spoken to in 3 years began arriving. Word had spread about the siege, about the fight, about the newlywed couple who'd stood against Lynch's entire gang. They came bringing food, offering help, expressing the kind of frontier solidarity that emerged when one of their own faced down evil and survived. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, part of a small Chinese settlement 20 miles north, arrived with a beautiful embroidered quilt and tears in her eyes. She spoke to Xiao Yue in rapid Chinese, the 2 women embracing like family, though they'd never met before. When Xiao Yue translated, Darren learned that Mrs. Chen had lost her own husband to bandits years ago, understood the particular grief and resilience required of frontier women. "She says I'm very lucky to find a good man willing to fight for me," Xiao Yue told Darren, her eyes bright with emotion. "She says the frontier needs more men like you. Tell her I'm the lucky one." By evening, the cabin had been transformed. New door, new windows, most of the bullet holes patched and sealed. It would need paint eventually, proper finishing, but it was whole again, livable. The neighbors had contributed not just labor, but personality. Someone had brought curtains for the windows. Another had donated a proper bed frame to replace Darren's bedroll. Mrs. Chen had left not just the quilt, but also dishes and cooking utensils to replace what had been destroyed. When the last of the helpers departed, Darren and Xiao Yue stood together surveying their transformed home. It looked different than before, brighter, more welcoming, as though the repairs had somehow repaired more than just wood and glass. "It's beautiful," Xiao Yue said softly. "It actually feels like a home now." "That's because it is. Before it was just a place I existed. Now it's where we live." That night they lay together in their new bed, exhausted but satisfied, listening to the quiet sounds of the desert at peace. No gunfire, no threatening voices, just wind and crickets and the distant howl of a coyote singing to the stars. Darren? Xiao Yue's voice was drowsy, half asleep already. What will we do with the reward money after the repairs? He'd been thinking about that. Expand the ranch maybe, buy proper breeding stock, build up a horse operation. This land's not good for much, but horses could thrive here. I'd like that. I've been learning about horses from watching you. They're beautiful animals, strong and loyal. Like someone else I know. She laughed softly. Stubborn and loyal, you mean? They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Darren's dreams were peaceful for the first time in years. No nightmares of betrayal or loss, just quiet contentment and the warmth of another person choosing to stay. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Darren and Xiao Yue worked together, rebuilding not just the cabin, but their entire operation. They repaired the barn, reinforced the corral, dug a better well. With part of the reward money, they purchased 3 young mares and a solid breeding stallion from a rancher in the next territory. Xiao Yue learned to gentle the horses, discovered she had a natural gift for it. The animals responded to her patience and quiet strength, gentling under her hands in ways that impressed even experienced horsemen. She also continued improving her English through constant practice, losing more of her accent while retaining the musical quality that made her speech distinctive. She learned frontier cooking from Mrs. Chen during weekly visits to the Chinese settlement, returning with new recipes and stories that made Darren laugh. She planted a small garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil with determination that bordered on miraculous. And she shot. Every few days, she and Darren would practice together, her accuracy becoming deadly reliable. She never said why she insisted on maintaining the skill, but Darren understood. After what she'd survived, she would never allow herself to be helpless again. For his part, Darren found himself opening up in ways he'd thought impossible. He introduced Xiao Yue to the few neighbors he'd kept at arm's length for 3 years, attended community gatherings he'd previously avoided, even accepted help from others when projects grew too large for 2 people alone. The walls he'd built around himself crumbled brick by brick, replaced by something healthier, boundaries that allowed connection while maintaining dignity. He told Xiao Yue more about his past, about the ranch he'd lost and the people who'd betrayed him. She listened without judgment, holding his hand through the difficult parts, asking questions that helped him process pain he'd been avoiding for years. "Do you ever want to go back?" she asked one evening as they watched the sunset from their repaired porch. "Confront them? Demand an explanation?" "I used to. Spent the first year here imagining all the things I'd say, all the ways I'd make them understand what they'd done." Darren pulled her closer. "But that was before you. Now I realize going back would just be reopening old wounds. What's done is done. This is my life now. Our life. And it's better than anything I had before." "Even with the bullet holes?" "Especially with the bullet holes. They remind me what we survived together, what we're capable of when we refuse to quit." 3 weeks after the siege, they made the journey to Denver for the trial. The city overwhelmed Xiao Yue at first. So many people, so much noise, buildings stacked close together in ways that felt claustrophobic after the open desert. But she faced the courthouse with the same courage she'd shown facing Lynch's guns, testifying with clear-eyed precision about the massacre, about the bandits, about every detail that would ensure justice. The surviving gang members were sentenced to hang. Darren watched Xiao Yue's face as the verdict was read, saw the complex emotions playing across her features: satisfaction, sorrow, relief, grief. Justice delivered, but at such terrible cost. "It doesn't bring them back," she said quietly as they left the courthouse. "My family. Nothing brings them back." "No, but it prevents them from hurting other families. That's worth something." She nodded, leaning against him as they navigated the crowded Denver streets. "Can we go home now? I miss the quiet." "Home." She said it naturally, without hesitation. The ranch that had been Darren's lonely exile was now their shared sanctuary, the place they both longed to return to. They collected the federal compensation, a substantial sum that reflected the value of her family's lost goods and the trauma of her testimony. Combined with the reward money, they now had enough to truly build something significant, On the journey back, they stayed at a small inn halfway between Denver and their ranch. That night, lying in an actual proper bed with real sheets, Xiaoyue turned to Darren with unusual solemnity. I've been thinking about the future, about what we're building. And I want children, eventually. I want to fill that cabin with life and noise and the kind of chaos that comes from family. Her eyes searched his. But I'm also terrified. Terrified of loving people again and losing them, of building something beautiful and watching it burn. Darren pulled her close, understanding the fear because he felt it too. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. The frontier's dangerous, life's uncertain, and we both know how quickly everything can be taken away. He tilted her face up to meet his eyes. But I can promise I'll fight for our family with everything I have. That I'll protect what we build with the same determination we used to survive Lynch. That's the best any of us can do. It's enough, she whispered. You're enough. They made love that night with a tenderness that held both passion and promise. Two people choosing to be vulnerable again despite knowing the risks, choosing to build despite the possibility of loss. When they finally arrived back at the ranch, the sun was setting, painting everything in familiar golden light. The cabin looked solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire before leaving. The horses whinnied greetings from the corral. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, yet somehow different because they were different. More certain now, more committed to the future they were creating together. Over the following months, they used their combined resources to expand their operation significantly. They purchased more land, adding another 100 acres to the south. Built a proper stable for their growing horse herd. Hired 2 ranch hands, young men looking for honest work and a chance to learn the horse trade. The ranch that had been one man's bitter refuge became a thriving operation, known throughout the territory for producing quality breeding stock. Xiaoyue became a fixture in the local community, her Chinese heritage and elegant bearing making her stand out, but her kindness and competence earning universal respect. She organized a cooperative among the frontier women, sharing skills and resources, creating the kind of support network that made survival less lonely. Mrs. Chen became like family, visiting weekly, teaching Xiaoyue traditional crafts while learning English in return. The gray mare with the injured leg healed slowly under Xiaoyue's patient care, eventually recovering enough to become her personal mount. She named the horse May, after her lost sister, and rode her daily across the ranch land with increasing confidence. One afternoon, about 6 months after the siege, Xiaoyue approached Darren with unusual nervousness. He was working on a new section of fence, and she handed him water while fidgeting with her collar. I have something to tell you, she said. Something important. Darren's stomach clenched. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Too right, maybe. She took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. About 2 months along, Mrs. Chen helped me confirm it. For a moment, Darren couldn't breathe. A child. Their child. The future made tangible and real in a way that both terrified and thrilled him. He'd spent so long avoiding connections, avoiding the vulnerability that caring created. Now he was being offered the deepest connection of all. Say something, Xiaoyue pleaded. You're scaring me with that expression. Darren pulled her into his arms, held her so tight she gasped. I'm terrified, he admitted. Absolutely terrified, and happier than I've been in my entire life. She laughed, the sound breaking with emotion. Me too. Both of those things at once. They stood there in the desert afternoon, holding each other, letting the magnitude of new life settle over them like a blessing. Around them, the ranch continued its daily rhythms, horses grazing, ranch hands calling to each other, wind moving through sage. Life continuing, building, growing. The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Xiaoyue's initial fears. Mrs. Chen attended her regularly, bringing traditional herbs and modern medical knowledge in equal measure. Darren became almost comically protective, trying to prevent Xiaoyue from doing any heavy work, despite her laughing protests that she wasn't fragile. You fought off an entire gang of bandits while bleeding from a knife wound, she reminded him when he tried to stop her from lifting a feed bucket. I think I can handle basic ranch chores while pregnant. That was different. How? Because then I didn't know what I'd do if I lost you. Now I do, and it terrifies me. She set down the bucket and took his face in her hands. You're not going to lose me. I'm stronger than I look, remember? I survived a massacre, desert heat, and your cooking. I can certainly survive childbirth." Despite her confidence, Darren insisted on hiring a midwife from Denver to stay with them as the due date approached. The woman, a capable no-nonsense type named Sarah, arrived a month early and immediately took charge of preparations with the kind of military efficiency that both impressed and intimidated everyone. When Xiao Yue's labor began on a cool autumn morning, Darren discovered new depths of helplessness. All his frontier competence, all his ability to face down bandits and build ranches, meant nothing in the face of his wife's pain. He could only hold her hand, wipe her forehead, murmur encouragement while Sarah and Mrs. Chen managed the actual medical aspects. The labor lasted through the day and into evening, each hour stretching endlessly, while Darren paced and prayed to forces he'd stopped believing in years ago. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl with a powerful set of lungs, Darren felt something crack open in his chest, some last protective barrier he'd been maintaining without realizing it. Sarah placed the baby in his arms, this tiny, perfect creature wrapped in blankets, and Darren understood for the first time what it meant to love someone more than life itself. Not just romantic love like he felt for Xiao Yue, but something fiercer and more primitive, the absolute certainty that he would burn the world to keep this child safe. "She's beautiful," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Xiao Yue, exhausted but radiant, reached for the baby. "She looks like you." The same stubborn chin. "Let's hope she has your common sense to balance it out." They named her Lily, a name that worked in both English and Chinese, that symbolized both strength and beauty. Lily Holt, born of violence, survived, and love chosen, entered the world screaming defiance at the autumn wind. The months that followed brought new challenges: sleepless nights, constant feeding, the terror of being responsible for something so small and fragile. But they also brought unexpected joys. Lily's first smile, her first laugh, the way she would calm instantly when Darren sang to her in his rough, unpracticed voice. The ranch continued to prosper. Their horse breeding program gained reputation throughout the territory, with buyers traveling from as far as California to purchase their stock. Darren hired more hands, built another stable, expanded into training as well as breeding. Xiao Yue managed the business side with sharp intelligence, negotiating prices and managing accounts with the same determination she'd shown learning to shoot. On Lily's first birthday, they threw a celebration that drew neighbors from 50 miles in every direction. The cabin couldn't hold everyone, so they set up tables outside, served food that combined frontier staples with Chinese dishes Xiao Yue had learned from Mrs. Chen. Children ran wild among the horses, while adults shared stories and laughter under the endless desert sky. Sheriff Tompkins attended, bringing news that the last of Lynch's gang had been captured in New Mexico. "That chapter's finally closed," he told Darren. "You and your family can rest easy knowing those men will never threaten anyone again." Darren looked across the crowd to where Xiao Yue sat holding Lily, surrounded by friends, laughing at something Mrs. Chen had said. His wife, his daughter, his community, his life rebuilt from ashes into something more beautiful than anything he'd lost. "We already were resting easy," Darren said, "but thank you for making sure justice was served." As the celebration continued into evening, Darren found a quiet moment alone with Xiao Yue while Lily napped in Mrs. Chen's capable arms. They stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar golden light. "Do you ever think about that day?" Xiao Yue asked. "When I collapsed in your desert and you had to decide whether to help me?" "Sometimes. I think about how close I came to riding past, how different everything would be if I'd made that choice." "What stopped you, really? What made you turn back?" Darren considered the question seriously. "I'd like to say it was nobility or compassion, but honestly I think it was desperation. I was so tired of being alone, so tired of the half-life I'd built for myself. Some part of me recognized that you were a chance, maybe the last chance, to become human again." "And did you? Become human again?" He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "I became better than human. I became part of something larger than myself. Husband, father, partner, friend. All the things I'd sworn off after the betrayal. All the things that make life worth living." Xiao Yue turned in his arms to face him fully. "I used to think survival was enough, that if I just kept breathing, kept moving forward, that would be victory over the men who killed my family. She touched his face gently. But you taught me that survival isn't the same as living, that we owe it to ourselves and to those we've lost to build something beautiful from the ashes. Around them, the celebration continued. Neighbors laughing, children playing, life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. The ranch that had been born from isolation and defended with blood had become a symbol of something hopeful, a testament to the idea that broken people could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that love was worth the risk of loss. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Darren and Xiao Yue rejoined their guests. Someone had brought a fiddle, and music filled the air. Children danced while adults clapped rhythm. Lily woke and added her delighted laughter to the symphony of celebration. Later, after the guests had departed and Lily was asleep in her cradle, Darren and Xiao Yue lay in their bed watching moonlight stream through windows that had been shattered and rebuilt. "What are you thinking about?" Xiao Yue asked, her head on his chest. "That I spent 3 years convinced happiness was something that happened to other people. That I'd had my chance and lost it through trust misplaced." He ran his fingers through her hair. "Then you arrived and proved me wrong about everything." "Not wrong, just not finished. Your story wasn't over. It was just waiting for the next chapter." "Our story," he corrected. "Not mine. Ours." "Yes, ours. And our daughters. And whoever else comes along to join it." They fell asleep holding each other, two people who'd survived impossible odds to build something neither could have imagined alone. The desert wind sang outside, the same wind that had witnessed Xiao Yue's desperate flight and Darren's lonely isolation. But now it whispered different stories of partnership and healing, of courage and second chances, of the fierce determination required to transform survival into life. Years would pass. More children would come. 2 boys who inherited their mother's determination and their father's stubbornness. The ranch would grow into one of the most respected horse operations in the territory. Darren and Xiao Yue would face other challenges, other hardships, because the frontier never stopped testing those who tried to build something permanent on its harsh soil. But they would face everything together, the way they'd faced Lynch's guns and their own broken histories. As partners who'd chosen each other not despite their scars, but because of them. As 2 pieces of shattered jade mended with gold, made more beautiful by the breaking and the repair. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, they would sometimes stand together in their doorway, watching the sunset paint the desert gold, remembering the day a desperate woman collapsed in the dust and a lonely man made the choice that saved them both. The choice to care, to fight, to believe that broken things could be made whole again through stubborn love and shared courage. The choice that transformed a worthless piece of desert into home and 2 damaged strangers into family. The choice that proved, against all odds and reason, that the frontier's harshest lessons, loss, betrayal, violence, could be answered with something stronger. Hope. Partnership. Love that refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. And in the end, that made all the difference.